O God, may your spirit and guidance be in us as we work for the benefit of all our people, for peace and justice in our land, and for the constant recognition of the dignity and aspirations for those whom we serve. Amen. Amen. Sounded better, eh?
Good afternoon, members. Minister's statement. Minister of Health and Social Service.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as most of the N.W.T. residents are probably aware, as of today, the consumption of cannabis is legal across Canada. Interesting spot for a clap. Our government committed in our mandate to create the policy, program, and legislative regimes necessary to support legalization, and with that comes a firm commitment to public education and awareness. Public education and awareness efforts are underway across the Northwest Territories. The Department of Health and Social Services has been working in partnership with other N.W.T. departments and agencies, the federal government, to make sure that the N.W.T. residents have the important evidence-based information that they need about the health, social, and legal aspects of cannabis use they need to make informed decisions. Mr. Speaker, we have taken a harm reduction approach that builds off the Canada's lower risk guidelines for cannabis use developed by the Centre for Addiction and Mental Health. Using this harm reduction approach, our government has made it a priority to make sure that residents are aware of the significant risks of cannabis use on brain development and other health issues, and its potential effects on children, youth, pregnant and nursing women, and people with mental health issues. As a government, we have been working diligently since August 2016 to ensure public education materials were developed to meet the needs of our residents and help them prepare for legalization of cannabis. This includes new web content, direct mail to all households and businesses in the Northwest Territories, parent talk kits, traditional and social media advertising, radio and web content in all N.W.T. Indigenous languages, as well as school-based education events. The campaign has included informational videos, materials for teachers and students in schools, community surveys, and the identification of community champions to help provide messaging to residents. Cannabis education resources are also being provided at the community health fairs, which are held throughout the Northwest Territories. Recently, our campaign included hosting Dr. Matthew Hill, a neurologist from the University of Calgary's Hodgkin's Brain Institute. Through a series of in-person and online streaming events, Dr. Hill was able to field questions from youth, teachers, parents and caregivers, and health professionals about health considerations related to cannabis use, especially where it relates to brain health. We had over 125 N.W.T. residents tune in to a live Facebook chat with the neurologist. Approximately 200 high school students were in Yellowknife, as well as 30 classrooms across the territories benefited from a live question and answer session with Dr. Hill. Making sure that our health professionals have access to the information that they need to do their jobs now that cannabis is legal has also been a focus area for the Department of Health and Social Services. Approximately 60 health professionals from around the territories participated in a special session focused on the latest research pertaining to the effects of cannabis use on mental health and specifically post-traumatic stress disorder. This was the second cannabis health expert we have brought to the territory to present on public health evidence related to cannabis use and directly answer Northerners' questions about cannabis and their health. Mr. Speaker, we understand that many N.W.T. residents have concerns related to the legalization of cannabis and its potential impacts on individuals and communities. These concerns are not baseless, and it is our responsibility to provide messaging and materials that are culturally relevant, are tailored to our northern population, and are understood by the residents so that they can make informed decisions about cannabis use. For youth under 25, pregnant and breastfeeding women, and those experiencing mental health issues, there are very real health concerns. The legalization of cannabis opens up new opportunities for honest, straightforward conversations with N.W.T. residents about the known health considerations for those who use cannabis. These conversations weren't always happening prior to legalization, when cannabis was still readily available on the black market and widely used throughout our territories. We welcome this opportunity for frank dialogue. Mr. Speaker, now that cannabis is legal, the effort of our government to provide information and education sessions to our residents doesn't stop. More sessions are in the works. Our presentations on cannabis health information at community living fairs will continue. These fairs offer a very personal and direct way to communicate with N.W.T. residents living in our smallest communities about health issues that are important to them. We will also have the presence at festivals and sporting events and other places where people gather and cannabis is likely to be consumed. New and engaging cannabis health education materials are also under development and will be rolled out over the coming weeks. We have invested significant time and energy developing and pilot testing these materials and engaging uniquely northern voices in the communication of key health messages. As our public education campaign continues, we'll be partnering with the federal government to expand cannabis public education efforts in Northwest Territories communities. This will include community and school activities, visual and social media content in all N.W.T. official languages, as well as community resources. Mr. Speaker, in addition to the health information our government is sharing about cannabis, the federal government is active on the issue as well. Their cannabis public education efforts include social media, paid advertising and promotional materials, all of which are helping to provide important information to residents in our territories and throughout Canada. We are working alongside our federal counterparts to ensure consistency in our messaging and to ensure we complement rather than overlap in our efforts. Mr. Speaker, we have made a long-term commitment to ensuring that our residents have the most up-to-date information on cannabis so that they can make informed decisions about its use. We know from our extensive consultation with youth from across the territory that they want health information delivered in a manner that is interactive, builds on the knowledge and experience they already have, and is creative. These expressed needs shared our cannabis public education plan, or shaped our public cannabis education plan, and will continue to inform our public awareness and education efforts for the government moving forward. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister's statement. Minister Ike Godani, the Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, our government has committed in its mandate to pursue innovative ways to prevent and reduce crime. Our experience has shown that it is not possible to administer a system of justice exactly the same way throughout our territory. Each community is different, with their own unique set of priorities and their own way of addressing local justice needs. Our government provides training and funding for all communities to hire justice coordinators, support community justice committees, and develop culturally relevant crime prevention programs. Community justice committees, comprised of volunteers from the community, help to develop alternatives to the criminal justice system in their home community. Community justice coordinators are key liaisons between community members, the RCMP, local supports and services, and offenders. What our community justice supports and programs help our justice system to take into account is that people who commit crimes have homes and families. Almost all of them eventually come back to their communities. With the right training and support from our government, local community justice committees can be part of the planning for an offender's safe return. This work is not always easy. Offenders need to know what supports are available to help them with their release plan, and community members need to know about how offenders have committed to addressing the problems that led to the crime when they get home. Community justice coordinators and committees can help an offender develop a plan and follow it. Offenses that get referred to a community justice committee are addressed through a restorative model of justice. As more matters are diverted to the restorative process, fewer people are charged with crimes and therefore are not ending up in the corrections system. The RCMP is an important partner in the successful use of community justice approach in our communities. When police and victims gain trust in their community's restorative approach, the number of referrals to the Community Justice Committee increases. Restorative approaches respect the dignity of victims and holds people accountable for their actions. It does not replace the courts, but it can include such things as family group conferencing as well as victim and offender conferencing. It is a different way of dealing with minor offenses and a different way to help an offender plan to return to the community after serving a sentence. Mr. Speaker, there is innovative work happening throughout the Northwest Territories in support of community justice. Some community justice committees are working with their local probation officers to deliver the substance abuse management and violence prevention programs. Others are hosting large events like the Odd Squad in Delaney and Fort McPherson and the Real Youth Video Project in Fort Simpson. Justice committees are also supporting ongoing programs like the Fort Liard's Men's Support Circle and youth empowerment projects in N.W.T, who meet regularly to offer peer support and focus on healthy choices. Mr. Speaker, our residents know what community safety and wellness supports their communities need, and our government is proud to help them make those things happen. Throughout our territory, every week, our government is supporting youth programming, on-the-land activities, and addiction awareness workshops developed locally by justice coordinators and committees. I applaud the work that the community justice committees and the coordinators are doing to enhance the quality of life in our communities and thank them for being partners to helping us meet our mandate commitments to reduce and prevent crime. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister's statement. Minister, you can go down to the Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I wish to advise members that the Honourable Wally Schuman will be late arriving in the House today to attend a video conference before the House of Commons Standing Committee on Indigenous and Northern Affairs. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister's statements. Minister's statements. Member statements. Member for Trinidad-Willowdale.
Mr. Speaker, recently the province of Quebec elected a new government. The new government said the legal age for purchasing and consuming cannabis will be 21. The Prime Minister responded by saying the age proposed by the Premier-elect will only feed the illegal cannabis market. The Prime Minister's reason was that people in Quebec between the age of 18 and 21 will continue to use street dealers to purchase cannabis. Mr. Speaker, if we don't open the doors for small businesses to get into the legal distribution and selling of cannabis within our small communities, I fear we may create a similar situation. Cannabis users in small communities will not have easy access to cannabis products unless they walk down the street to buy it illegally. I realize the small communities can buy online, however, you would likely need a credit card. Therefore, Mr. Speaker, this government must work towards creating equal access for cannabis users in small communities as exists in larger centres with liquor stores. We also must look internally for suppliers of cannabis within the N.W.T. In other words, Mr. Speaker, we should open the idea of cultivating cannabis grow-ops within the N.W.T. Already there are many businesses across Canada that are growing cannabis on a mass scale to supply this country's new marketplace. We in the North, Mr. Speaker, are once again in a position where industries from outside the Northwest Territories are reaping benefits of sales made within the territory. Going forward, the N.W.T. should seriously consider the great potential of our own homegrown products can provide. Mr. Speaker, the N.W.T's cannabis stock will be supplied by 3 southern companies. Just imagine if the majority of the territory's cannabis needs was filled by northern distributors. I truly believe that the N.W.T. must seize the opportunity to tap into this emerging industry before we fall too far behind. Lastly, Mr. Speaker, our government officials across the country are fearful that Canada's current stock of cannabis is too small, creating a cannabis shortage in the legal market. This also would force cannabis users to once again turn to the illegal market. Legal cannabis presents great business opportunities for people in the N.W.T. We cannot afford to continue to hamper the full potential of our territory. We must quickly facilitate the growth and distribution of cannabis within the N.W.T. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Hear, hear.
Merci. Member statements. Member Ika Goodman and then Member Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I want to provide a quick report card on Cabinet's cannabis legalization preparedness. First of all, the sales site of the new N.W.T. Liquor and Cannabis Commission popped up today to sell cannabis online, although it's extremely hard to find and there are no links from N.W.T. sites. On the information side, a number of departmental websites deal with cannabis. If one department could win a prize on this, it would be Health and Social Services. It has a good assortment of information, documents, and links on health effects of cannabis. The department sponsored an online talk by a health expert and then sent out a mailer, as the minister mentioned earlier today. The Department of Justice website has some information for tenants and landlords on cannabis use in plants, but nothing on policing or penalties for cannabis law violations. Department of Executive and Intergovernmental Affairs has some general information with topics including possession restrictions, growing cannabis, buying it, and impaired driving. Infrastructure has a bit on impaired driving. The Workers' Safety and Compensation Commission has a general information sheet that deals with cannabis as a fitness to work and impairment matter. There is nothing on the Department of Finance other than a link to the executive web page. The Culture, Employment, Department of Education, Culture and Employment, or MACA, websites have nothing. There is nothing yet in place for private cannabis retail to fulfill Cabinet's commitment to allow private retail within 6 months after passage of the bill. I'm not aware of any government-wide communications, plans or efforts, and given the uneven coverage of cannabis on departmental web pages, some improvements are clearly in order. There are also issues about the transparency and accountability for the revenues. Our government will receive revenues and spend funds on implementation activities. Revenues will show up in the Liquor Revolving Fund, and there will be separate reporting on cannabis versus liquor. It is not clear what Cabinet intends to spend in terms of implementation. The picture I'm painting here is one of a lack of coordination, and there is still no overall plan for cannabis from our government. We need a robust monitoring and evaluation framework that includes public reporting. This is exactly what the standing committees requested, Cabinet promised, and has yet to deliver. Mr. Speaker, where is the plan? I will have questions for the Minister of Finance later today. Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Member statements. Member Ika Goodman and then Member Kamlik.
Mr. Speaker, today marks an important day in the history of Canada and how we as a nation address the social and physiological issue of addiction. 95 years of cannabis prohibition has failed to achieve the ends it sets out to achieve. It has not curbed illegal markets, nor has it righted social wrongs. Prohibition does not ensure that communities are safe. Rather, it opens them up to gangsters and bootleggers who are accountable to no one, who cut their products with toxins, and who are all too often is accompanied by violence. Bootlegging is a problem that affects us all in the N.W.T. The consequences of illegally imported controlled substances circumventing local laws is an ever-challenging issue which requires vigilance on the part of all governments and law-abiding citizens. I want to start off by commending the N.W.T. for their efforts to make available to the public a great deal of evidence-based resources. Household mailers, talking kits, fact sheets, newspaper ads, and webcasts hosted by health experts are just some of the measures which have been made available to the public. I am proud to see that this and other governments all over Canada are making joint efforts towards shaping conversations as opposed to pushing for convictions of minor offences. Most impressively, I wish to note the audio recordings made on the topic of health effects of cannabis that have been published in 9 official Indigenous languages, and English and French. It is of utmost importance that all peoples in the N.W.T. are made aware in their language of choice of the effects, good and bad, and otherwise, that come with the legalization of cannabis. The aforementioned resources made available to teachers, caregivers, students, and clinicians are key to ensure a healthy and prosperous future for all those who live in our territory. We, as parents, caregivers, and elders, have a duty to let these tough conversations to play out with those we love and care for. We all have a responsibility to ensure that Northerners know how to remain compliant with this new legal framework. To purchase, an individual must be 19 years of age, and no one can possess in public more than 30 grams of cannabis. But most importantly, the dangers to oneself and one's community when operating a vehicle while impaired by cannabis or alcohol must not be forgotten or understated. Mr. Speaker, Northerners have come a long way since the 1920s, and today marks the beginning of the end of prohibition and the start of a bold new era where we can actually make meaningful difference in the high rates of substance abuse in the Northwest Territories and across Canada. I am looking hopefully forward to a future where these rates will come down, where our communities will be safer and our children will be protected. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Member statement. Member Ika Goodani, the member Yellowknife Centre.
Mr. Speaker, here we are October 17th and recreational cannabis is now available to everyone who is 19 years and older. For regular MLAs, it's been a rushed and at times overwhelming sprint to this point. And even now, the government doesn't have all the pieces in place, such as a fully costed implementation plan. Let's pause and take stock of how we got here. First of all, legalization wasn't our idea. It was the feds who decided that regular citizens should no longer be made criminals because they smoke pot. Our response to this downloaded priority has consumed huge amounts of this Assembly's time and treasure and energy. Other priorities have been pushed aside. It's worth remembering that the effect of cannabis is to alter consciousness, or in other words, to become intoxicated. This is recreational, not medicinal cannabis. During our public hearings in the spring, elders spoke of their concerns about legalizing another intoxicant. We in the N.W.T have a sadly large experience with the results of people becoming too intoxicated too often, with the social toll of dependency and costs of recovery. During those same hearings, parents voiced concern about the effects of cannabis on the brain development of young people. There is a significant downside here for youth and important questions about impaired driving for people of all ages. So you won't hear me cheering today. Another benefit the federal government has been touting is an end to the black market, taking cannabis sales into the public taxation system and drying up revenue for organized crime. In our jurisdiction, I have my doubts about these so-called benefits. First, you'll need a lawyer to get through the paperwork to set up a private store here. If you live at the end of a Canada Post box, your online order may be delivered by the end of the month. Even if people have credit cards, which many don't, the black market in small communities will be easy and quick, as it's always been. What we have today is the beginning of new vigilance. We need to assess whether the approach we've been hurried to institute is appropriate, to evaluate it soon and often and adjust as necessary. We need to monitor the use and effects of pot on our youth and citizens, on the need for dependency treatment, and the possible health care consequences of smoking behaviours. I'll have questions for the Minister of Health and Social Services. Merci.
Massey. Member statement. Member Ika Goodani, the member Yellowknife North.
Mr. Speaker, there is a buzz in the room today. Bad joke number one. But seriously, Mr. Speaker, for all our lives, marijuana has been an illegal drug. Some see it as an evil influence that must be banned. To others, it's a harmless, fun pastime. Certainly, it's always galvanized energetic public debate. Today, Mr. Speaker, that all changes. Cannabis becomes legal, not just for medical use, but for recreational use as well. And as we're seeing, the impacts are going to be enormous. The public discourse about cannabis has shown what a wide range of impacts are anticipated. Impacts on health, on youth, on policing and enforcement. Where will cannabis be legal? How will it be sold? Who will get the profits? I'd like to commend my colleagues who were involved in the public consultation process. I think they did a good job of talking and listening to Northerners to find out what they wanted from a legal cannabis management regime. Mr. Speaker, it's a core mandate commitment of the 18th Assembly and basic need of our territory to grow and diversify the economy. Over the last 3 years, we have spoken a lot about various ways of doing this. We've encouraged agriculture, tourism, renewable energy, local manufacturing, and more. I hope that maintaining tight government control over cannabis, even for only 6 months, won't jeopardize a great economic prospect. I urge the government to encourage communities and business to engage with the process, actively prepare, and be ready in 6 months to capitalize on this new opportunity for commercial growth and job creation. We're at the dawn of a new era, Mr. Speaker. No one knows exactly how this will play out, but legal cannabis will revolutionize Canadian society and the economy. I support the government in making sure cannabis is managed carefully. We must be fully mindful of health issues, the safety of youth, road safety, policing, and a host of other questions. But I also want to encourage the government to be bold in recognizing the opportunity presented by this new sector to create jobs and wealth for Northerners. Oh, and also of note, Mr. Speaker, as of today, the ever-popular tie clip can second as a new multi-use paraphernalia tool. Bad joke number 2. Enjoy responsibly, everyone. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Member statement. Member Ike Goodin and the member Satu.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Preparatory measures. Mr. Speaker, project planning an essential element for project success. Mr. Speaker, the Fort Good Hope Gashagodene Council, with funding, sponsorship, and support from the Department of Education, Culture, and Employment, are initiating a driver training course in Red Deer, Alberta. Starting tomorrow, there will be 9 Satu students receiving training. Mr. Speaker, I would like to recognize the partnership companies Divergent Employment Solutions, Career Assistance Network, the Fort Good Hope Gashagodene Community Council, and funding sources, ECE and assets. Mr. Speaker, these initiatives are the foundations of statements as mentioned previously by the Minister. The best social program is a job. During my time here, I respectfully concur. Mr. Speaker, a rewarding segment of this training plan is employment positions are underway upon completion. This can lead to material supply chain transportation for the Great Bear River Bridge assembly opportunities to come. Merci.
Merci. Member statement. Member Ike Goodin and the member Mackenzie Delta.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it can sometimes feel like we've been seeing wall-to-wall cannabis coverage for months now, following the federal government's decision to legalize cannabis, and then the N.W.T's creation of its own legislation. Regular members had a whirlwind 7 months to review the proposed laws, research best practices, talk to residents, hold public hearings, and work on making the legislation the best it could be. Mr. Speaker, I'm grateful that so many Northerners shared their views, values, and recommendations with us. Today, on the legalization day, we are breaking new ground. I know my colleagues will also have much to say on this subject. So I'd just like to highlight a few outstanding questions on the minds of people in the Mackenzie Delta, and I'm sure in other small communities too. It's my understanding that the RCMP will generally not be enforcing laws around smoking cannabis. That is, smoking in places where it's not allowed, nuisance issues, and similar violations. Here in the N.W.T, that job's been handed to bylaw officers in the communities with their own bylaws, and to environmental health officers with the Department of Health and Social Services. Unfortunately, Mr. Speaker, there are only 6 environmental health officers for the whole Northwest Territories, and only 3 of those are outside of Yellowknife. Mr. Speaker, not all Mackenzie Delta residents have the privilege of resident RCMP, and our communities don't have the resources for new bylaw officers or to pile new duties on current officers. This is just one of the examples of where we still have a long way to go. This government's responsibility for the cannabis preparedness doesn't end today. In fact, I think we're just getting started. Thank you, and I'll have questions later today.
Merci. Member statement. Member Ike Goodin and the member Decho.
Merci, Mr. Speaker. Just la région Gosela, Dutsala Zen Charlon de Guan Negmit only the Duni de the clothes of the corny de Dula Harago Queen Guara Kuti Deneshu Tini de Dulets of the con Kenlan de Mitzini de Harago Kelly de more like any de cannabis giddy. Kachina shield ano high goods and send down eat Metagwat Sola iti on Kilandia Kenlandi Metauti the Allah Shela 90 Kenlandi Metazeti on Shela hits it too Sedeko hit Shegoriti Kenlandi Dunametazeti. As you do say Conini the like the Liberal Party of Canada got the hardest the Kandi Jitotati legalize it to legitita San Conini there. Du temps gotlin de gojini de son kandi dana tsitu gora khotuta goti kandi kenshu agoti sa got ya dene kandi ko jagot ni de gotsa deni de tati kandi go charge go ini de yun dani de gala ken dani de go agodi ko dawdi se du temps gotlin de la du sale N.W.T 2012 gondi get singari ni de Duten Gutlin de Gojini de Chikua de Necunia, Honosula, Gotan Kyono Dingo, Esa de Dinsan, Candida Ons and Candid Trotagiti. Duten Gutlin de Nideshia, Jean Canada Goji, Ratsan Danide, Denet Diono Onki, Lemela Dina Denide, Kachina 21% get it, is San Candid Trotagati. That seminats in Senide Agia. Agia it is on its need there. Agio candid then a trotagit is on its need the Sondi Nadigo Jean Gondigari need there. Like Kotusala Kotiena Nata Jagots a summer Gondi Gwinly. I sit here so that ela Gosi Landia Gutindi di Gora. Say Landi Gorati Candid case on Kilandia without the thick Landi Gundi death. A Candigo Nahin Denny Italy la. Said then a kelek air with diani de the he condit lego and sago at ele. That said then a kelek air good sentiani de here sit lego tini the let's di. Is de must Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
Massey. Member statement. Member for Hay River North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, for consensus government to work, each minister must have a clear vision of what they want to achieve and be a strong enough leader to turn that vision into reality. In a party system, ministers have party members and political staff to help them develop a vision and associated policy. However, in our system, the minister's only support staff is the bureaucracy, which is not designed nor mandated to make the bold political decisions that are sometimes necessary. I'm concerned that in the absence of a bold vision, we will squander the opportunity to capitalize on what has potential to be the defining issue of this Assembly, the renewal of our post-secondary education system. Now, it's easy for regular members to stand up here and say what we would do if we were ministers. So that's what I'm going to do. If I were the Minister of Education, this is some of what I would have said on the first day of this sitting. Mr. Speaker, the report on the Aurora College Foundational Review has exposed this government's failure to provide adequate post-secondary education in the N.W.T. I take full responsibility and apologize to all of the college's students, teachers, and administrators for not providing them with a system in which they could all flourish. That being said, this is an exciting time because the review has given us a golden opportunity to start anew and begin to develop a world-class post-secondary education system. We will need help. So we're currently recruiting an Associate Deputy Minister to assist us. However, Mr. Speaker, make no mistake, this person will be there to turn our vision into reality, not to tell us what our vision is. We're already aware of the many educational needs that we must work to address and the many strengths we can build on. We know that we have many high school graduates who must be better prepared for post-secondary, so we will redouble our efforts in the JK-12 system. At the same time, we will mobilize our network of community learning centers to ensure that upgrading and expanded training opportunities are accessible to everyone. We will make use of our territory's natural advantages. We will strive to turn Inuvik into a world-renowned center for Arctic research and capitalize on its satellite and fiber optic infrastructure. We will work with industry to ensure Northerners have the right training to benefit from resource extraction. We will restore the luster of the college's Renewable Resources program, so once again it becomes one of the top in Canada. We will turn our trades program into one that attracts students from across Canada. And we will ensure that we support our residents who want to help the territory by becoming teachers, social workers, nurses, and other essential professionals. Mr. Speaker, we will do all of this and more, and I look forward to working with my colleagues and the residents of the territory to fully develop our vision. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. A little bit of excitement. Member statement. Member Ika Godan and the member Nanakput.
Kuyanani, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Government Northwest Territory Liquor Operations in Inuvik is contracted to Stanton Distributing, which is a wholly owned subsidiary of Inuvialuit Development Corporation. Mr. Speaker, that means that every Inuvialuit within the Inuvialuit settlement region, inside and outside, are registered shareholders. The Inuvialuit Development Corporation, in collaboration with Stanton's management, decided not to add the sale of licensed marijuana products to its contract between Stanton's and the N.W.T. Mr. Speaker, due to borders and customs laws within the United States, entry and exit of anyone associated with the distribution of licensed marijuana could possibly be denied entry into the United States. Mr. Speaker, Inuvialuit would travel back and forth to our relatives in Alaska and the lower 48. We co-manage in every aspect of conservation to enrich the culture and lifestyles of our harvesters and utilize our Indigenous knowledge system that improve the quality of livelihoods and culture. I understand that there may be a change in U.S. laws, but the IDC board still has to evaluate all aspects before any sort of reconsideration to the sale of a licensed product as it affects the IDC board, the IRC board, and all staff associated with the licensed facility. Mr. Speaker, this may provide opportunities within the Beaufort Delta region for the possible sales of cannabis. And Mr. Speaker, I look forward to the engagement between the government of the Northwest Territories and the Beaufort Delta region and the possibilities that may provide, as well as education into legal cannabis. Kuyanani, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Member statements. Member statements. Returns to oral questions. Returns to oral questions. Recognition of visitors in the gallery. Colleagues, please allow me to draw your attention to the presence today at the clerk's table, Mr. Anthony W.J. Whitford. As many of you know, Mr. Whitford is a man of many roles. Former commissioner, former speaker, former minister, former member, former sergeant at arms, and he joins us today in his capacity as honorary clerk. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Whitford to this house this afternoon. It's always a pleasure to have you at the table. Merci. And colleagues, we have special guests today here with us this afternoon. I'd like to draw your attention to people in the gallery. Please to recognize a group from Manitoba, the Manitoba legislative interns. They're here with us this week to learn more about our consensus-style government. With us today are Alexandra Bonney, Emma Cash, Jonathan Damon, Ashley Holler, Claire Johnston, and Kristen McCaig. Thank you for joining us here today. Recognition of visitors in the gallery. Member for Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Earlier today we had the grade 7 class from William MacDonald School in the gallery. I want to thank them and the teacher, Ms. Laura Bromley, for attending. I also have a constituent in the gallery, Ms. Kim McNerney. I want to recognize her and all the work that she's done with regard to responsible use of cannabis. Thank you very much. Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Recognition of visitors in gallery. Member for Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I too want to recognize Mr. Tony Whitford. Amongst his many roles, he is also a resident of Yellowknife North. and someone who is always in the building but doesn't make it down here often enough. I'd like to recognize my constituent assistant, Mr. Keith McNeil. Thank you, everyone, and welcome to the House.
Merci. Recognition of visitors in gallery. Member for Cam Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to recognize a Paige from the Cam Lake riding, Juliet Stephen. Thank you for all your work here today, supporting the members. I'd also like to recognize Mr. Keith McNeil, a fine member of the Cam Lake constituency. And finally, my constituency assistant, Mr. Michael Burchell, who recently moved to the Northwest Territories, and it's great to have him helping my office. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Recognition of visitors in gallery. Member for Yellowknife South.
I'm pleased to recognize a constituent of Yellowknife South, Leslie Goy. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Recognition of visitors in gallery. Member for N.W.T.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to recognize one of the pages, Ms. Tori Hogak, who is my cousin from Nuvik, living here in Yellowknife. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Recognition of visitors in gallery. Member for Range Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I know I'm supposed to stick to my constituency, but I need to recognize two people in the House. Kim McNeely, who worked with me professionally and is a personal friend, and also Leslie Goyt, who was instrumental in my campaign team. So I apologize if I'm breaking the rules, but welcome to this ledge.
Recognition of visitors in gallery. Recognition of visitors in gallery. If we're missing anyone in the gallery, thanks for being part of our proceedings. Acknowledgments. Acknowledgments. Oral questions. Member for Cam Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in my member statement, I talked about all the good things the government has done as it relates to legalization. Now I'm afraid I have to ask questions around what we're still lacking in our framework. Currently, the prices that we've all seen today on the online stores and the long lineups at cannabis and liquor stores, the price is around 2 to 4 times what the estimated street market is. This does not appear to be making a dent in the black market. Other members have raised these concerns. So I'd like to ask the Minister of Finance how he is monitoring the sale of black market cannabis and how they are ensuring our legal system is actually making a difference to curb the illicit trade of cannabis in the Northwest Territories. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, in the 12 hours that cannabis has been legal, there was some concern about the price. Difficult question to answer is, how will it affect the illegal market? Maybe we'll send out a questionnaire and ask if it's affected the illegal market's bottom line with the legalization of cannabis. But we will monitor it. We're 12 hours into legalization. We will monitor it. And even the early indications with folks lining up at the store and the online sales that we've had, that obviously has put a dent into the legal market. But we will continue to monitor it. And as I committed to committee, I will be giving them regular updates on the legalization and the effects it's have. But as to answer the question is, how do we know we're making a dent? We don't. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Not in 12 hours.
Oral question, Nakita, Council Member Cam Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I didn't ask have we made a dent in 1 hour. I asked how we are monitoring to ensure this process works. There was a commitment to bring forward a costed plan. There's still no costed plan. And the minister thinks this is a laughing matter. I think Northerners think this is a serious matter. So where is the plan? When is he going to bring it forward? And when is this side of the House going to be able to see it and evaluate it to make sure it protects our communities? Thank you.
Merci. There's 3 or 4 different questions, but I'll allow the Minister of Finance to answer.
Mr. Chair, Minister does not think it's a laughing matter. And, but having said that, it was said before that this was something that was sprung upon us by the federal government, and we worked hard to ensure that we were ready for it. The pricing market, we've given committee an update on the costing and how that was going to work. And we have the producer cost, we have the excise duty, we have the markup and the freight commissions, administration costs, and my understanding total retail price, and it depends on the strand, I believe, is around $10. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question. Tada Council Member Kamlik.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister is giving us elements of a plan, components of a plan, components of the regime, but not a fully costed, articulated plan that was voted on in this House as a recommendation of the committee's report and committed to in writing by the Minister. The Minister knew in 2015 this was coming. We didn't do any work, substantial work, until 2017. There was plenty of time to get things together. When is that plan going to come forward? I don't want to hear elements of the plan. I want to see a costed plan. Thank you.
Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the member is correct. I did make a commitment to provide an implementation plan. My understanding is we should have that took in committee's hands Monday at the latest. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question. Nundere Akasi, Member Kamlik.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And will that plan include the private sector regulations that, or the private store, private sale regulations that this government committed to and during the debates on the legislation? Thank you.
Minister of Finance.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we provided the regulations for private vendors to committee. I believe it's also on our website, so if those out there that are considering becoming a private vendor, there's opportunities there. It's on the website with all the conditions that they have to meet, and I would, I will follow up, but I would assume that would be part of the plan as well. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question. The member Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. My question is for the Minister of Finance, who's in charge of preparing for legalization and regulation of cannabis. It's clear from the public briefing on cannabis implementation we had on October 10th in the response to the committee report on Bill 6 that there is no overall government-wide plan for implementation. So we heard that the Minister says this plan is going to be available on Monday. When I look at the report from the response from Cabinet to the committee report, it says the Cannabis Legalization and Regulation Interdepartmental Working Group is developing a cannabis implementation plan. We'll provide copies of that plan committee prior to making it available to the public before October the 17th. That's today. Why didn't this working group or why didn't Cabinet deliver the plan in advance of today? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Finance.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it was not Cabinet, it was the Minister of Finance, and I wanted to ensure we had a plan that was going to be right. I do apologize to committee. I did make the commitment that we would have that before implementation day. Obviously, I missed that, so it's on me, but I will provide the plan to committee. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question. Council Member Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I want to thank the Minister for being forthright there. I look forward to the report, or the overall plan. So according to the Standing Committee, or the response to the Standing Committee report, there's going to be a breakdown of sales by online and by individual stores and by product type in annual reports from the Liquor and Cannabis Commission. But the expenditures for cannabis-related programs, including things like public education, public health research, community support, and so on, it's not clear where those are going to be reported. So can the Minister tell the public in this House whether any of the revenues from cannabis sales will actually be targeted for public education and how the costs of cannabis implementation will be reported? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, much like the revenue from liquor sale, that goes into a general revenue fund, which we in turn use to deliver a lot of the programs that we offer across the Northwest Territories. And 65% of our budget goes towards social programs. But as far as specifically earmarked, the answer is no. It will be put into general revenue, and we will in turn use that money to deliver many of the programs that we offer today. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Tadadea, Council Member Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I want to thank the Minister for that. I didn't really get a response about how we're going to report the costs of cannabis implementation, but one of the key changes that regular MLAs put into the Cannabis Legalization Regulation Implementation Act was the requirement for a review of the implementation, administration, and effectiveness of the legislation. So what measures, monitoring, reporting, or other means is the Minister putting in place now to ensure that the review of the legislation is meaningful and evidence-based? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Finance.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I apologize to the member, his question on the report. I will continue to give committee an update as we move forward, as making it part of the overall report. I mean, we can, as we unroll this, we can see how we can provide all the information to committee that's required. And as far as the monitoring, I believe I made a commitment to committee that I would keep them up to date as we go into the legalization of cannabis. We can have regular updates if it's committee's wish. We do plan on preparing a report, whether it'll be in the life of this assembly, obviously, whether it's after a year after the legalization or 6 months after legalization. I would welcome feedback from committee. If they think 6 months is fine or a year would be better, then I will take their advice. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Nundere, Council Member Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I want to sincerely thank the Minister for that commitment to work with regular MLAs in designing that report, and I think that's a good commitment. We now have the draft regulations that could enable private retail of cannabis, but in my view, they're clearly flawed. The Minister has total and complete discretion over any applications. There's no timeline for approval or even a requirement for decisions to be made. No appeal process, and authority for the Minister to determine the financial feasibility of a proposed operation. It's not even clear whether a committee or public input is being sought at this point. I know that we're all under deadlines, but is the Minister actually interested and willing to make changes to these flawed regulations? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, first of all, I don't believe the regulations are flawed. Maybe they do need some work. Again, we're 12 hours into the legalization, and it's a moving target. So the regulations are not flawed. As for the Minister having the absolute discretion, ministers or those decision makers rely on a business plan, a business case being presented to become vendors, and we have the technical folks have a look at them. They come forward with a recommendation. I don't think ministers, I would have the time to sit and review every application, but we rely on the technical folks. They come up with a recommendation. As far as the public input goes, I believe part of that is garnering some support from their local governments to see if there is a desire to have a private vendor in the community. So again, it's a moving target. We'll continue to work with members because this is a serious issue for folks across the Northwest Territories. And I want to ensure as a Legislative Assembly, and I speak of all 19 of us, I want to make sure that we have this right before we leave office. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, the member YELLOWKNIFE Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my questions are for the Minister of Health and Social Services. Recreational use of cannabis is not addictive in the sense that heroin is addictive, but it can create dependency behaviors that can be every bit as disruptive and unhealthy as alcohol, tobacco, or other substances. Is it the intention of our professional health services to adjust the way we scan the general population health, offer diagnostic services, promote and offer addictions treatment services, or make other adjustments concurrent upon the legalization of recreational cannabis use? Merci.
Merci. Minister of Health and Social Services.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we have been reaching out, as you heard in my statement earlier today, to professionals and people who have the knowledge that we need to incorporate it into our system here in the Northwest Territories. We're open and willing to learn when it comes to to medical marijuana and the impacts that it has on residents. But I think one of the important things is now we actually have the opportunity to have that frank dialogue and discussion with our residents in the Northwest Territories that not everybody has been prepared to have when it was illegal. And our staff are getting up to speed. They're getting to understand the implications of consuming cannabis on the body, on the mind, and we're prepared to evolve our system to meet those new realities. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Akita Cassie, member, Yellowknife Centre.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, with legalization, the message for youth is surely that pot has moved into the realm of being a little more okay than it was yesterday. A watchful eye on the proliferation of cannabis use among youth will be critical. How does the minister plan to ensure these new professionals have their pot antenna up and are listening? Massey.
Minister of Health and Social Service.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, once again, I'll go back to the opportunity for frank dialogue. Up until now, the conversation has been marijuana is illegal. You shouldn't be using it. Now the conversation is cannabis is legal, but we know it has profound impact on the development of young people's minds and brains, as well as pregnant mothers, youth, and all of those different at-risk categories. We can now have informed discussions with those residents to help them understand those implications and those ramifications of utilizing the product. The health practitioners, as a system, we've been reaching out to experts who can help us get informed, help us speak the right language when it comes to encouraging people not to use, especially at-risk populations. I think we have the opportunity now to have those important discussions that we haven't necessarily had because traditionally the conversation has been around, it's illegal, you shouldn't consume. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Oral question, Untitled Chapter, member, Yellowknife Centre.
Massey, Mr. Speaker, and thanks to the Minister for that answer. I realize that there isn't a lot of information because the substance was illegal. But now that it is, how does the Minister intend to track and report on the possibility of increased demand for dependency treatment services in the event of an increase in demand for pot itself? Thank you.
Massey. Minister of Health and Social Service.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, now that we move to a single system, you're getting really tired of hearing that, I'm sure. We have the ability to actually do things in a different way, whereas all authorities would have been tracking information in their own unique ways. We have an opportunity to ensure that we're collecting data in a simple and consistent way across the authorities. We're doing that work now. We know that cannabis is now legal. It's an opportunity for us to start incorporating that in. We haven't got the specifics in place, obviously, but it is certainly a conversation that has occurred, and we're looking for a way to make that happen. In the meantime, we will be reaching out to clients who are expressing concerns. We have electronic medical records that we can use to help collect data so that we can have better information for evidence-based decision-making in the future. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, N.W.T Cassie, member, Yellowknife Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's reassuring to hear that the Minister and his officials are prepared to collect information in this area. As my colleague from Mackenzie Delta said, preparedness doesn't end today. So can the Minister tell us how his health promotion and marketing efforts will be tailored to promote public health over the coming months and years? Thank you.
Minister of Health and Social Service.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, contrary to what some members have indicated, this is something we've been working on for quite some time. We've been working on this since 2016, trying to develop messaging and make sure that we're ready to get the information out there on the impacts of cannabis on the developing brain, as well as other health risks. Our community healthy living fairs are an important tool that we utilize to get into every community to get that information out to our residents. Those community living fairs are going to continue, as will this information continue to be included in those fairs. We also know that there's lots of professionals out there, like the professionals we've already brought up, who can help share information in a meaningful way with residents. We want to keep doing those types of things. On top of that, members have heard me say before that we have reached out to the federal government seeking some funding to help us tailor some community-specific messaging. I'm optimistic that we're going to be able to make a positive announcement on that funding in the next month or two. We have been working closely with the federal government and making progress in that area. Once we make that progress, once that is finalized, we'll be able to move forward and do more concrete community-focused communications around the use of cannabis throughout the Northwest Territories. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Oral question hikade Kenyan the member Tunade Wolade.
Archicho, Mr. Speaker. Speaker, this is kind of a difficult question. I don't even know who to pose the question to, so I'm going to pose the question to Minister of Health and Social Services. It's about elder abuse. Mr. Speaker, there's a real fear that there will be increased elder abuse, financial elder abuse, as a result of the legalization of cannabis. I'd like to ask the Minister if he could just give us anything on whether the departments, I guess maybe I'll ask the question is maybe whether the Department of Health and Social Services has had discussions on that issue that may be looming. Thank you.
Minister of Health and Social Service.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the member for raising the issue. It's not one that's actually been raised to us before. Having said that, the N.W.T. Senior Society is an amazing organization. They've done significant amount of work in this territories to put out literature and programs to educate people on elder abuse, as well as help individuals combat elder abuse and provide resources to them so that they know where to go to and where they can get supports when those types of things are occurring. They haven't reached out to me indicating that they're concerned about the potential growth in this area as a result of cannabis. Having said that, I take the member's point. I will have the department, I'll work with the department to draft up some communication with them to see if there's an opportunity for dialogue. We don't know if this is going to be a problem, but we should be ready. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Oral question Nakirade Kasi member Tunade Wolade.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I've noticed in my work in my business as MLA how helpful and the social workers are to the communities in all aspects, right from children to youth. I'd like to ask the Minister if there will be any special training given to the social workers in this area where it pertains to maybe as a result of the legalization of marijuana, where it pertains to elder abuse. Thank you.
Masi. Minister of Health and Social Service.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Once again, I acknowledge that there's certainly it's a valid conversation. I haven't had the conversation. I hear the member. I'm going to talk to the department, and I'd like to reach out to the Senior Society. They are an important partner. I also point out that we are an important partner in combating elder abuse. I haven't done any analysis on this. I'd like to know a little bit more about what's happening out there with respect to this particular topic before I make a commitment. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question Tadade Kasi member Tunade Wolade.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as many people in here know, I bring the issue of unemployment and the employment numbers of the small communities up many times in the House. And that's even increased when we start talking about between the ages of 15 and 24. Then the employment rates are really low when you get to that age category. That's the age category that I'm concerned about, that may be approaching the elders. And, you know, in most times, Mr. Speaker, elders don't even mind doing it. If they would give their last $20 to their youth in their own families. But I just like to ask the Minister if there is some thought about any very specific treatment that could be targeted at that group, the youth, some sort of youth treatment very specific to cannabis to prevent future elder abuse in the small communities. Thank you.
Minister of Health and Social Service.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, once again, I take the member's point. This is not a problem that we know exists or will exist. It's potentially there. And I'm prepared to reach out to the N.W.T. Senior Society to get their thoughts on whether they are concerned about this and whether or not they've had any discussion on plans. As far as education and training for our youth, We have been reaching out to youth. We've been working with education, culture, and employment to make sure that the message is out there on the harmful impacts of cannabis on the developing brain for youth up to 24 years old. That's going to continue. We need to continue to get that information out, because every day there's new kids, and every day there's new 23-year-olds, and every day there's new 22-year-olds, and every day. So we're working to get that information out there on a continual basis, make it part of our messaging going forward. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey, oral question. You can the member Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, today my questions are for the Minister of Finance, of course, about the topic of the day. Mr. Speaker, the government has decided to keep control of cannabis sales in-house for now, and only in communities with liquor stores for the next 6 months, it seems like. And of course, online orders will be shipped from by regular mail, and we all know how long mail can take at times. And so I'd like to ask the Minister, does the Minister have any concerns that this management regime will boost cannabis bootlegging in the small communities, in particular resulting in less effective control of the product and increasing demand on law enforcement? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, cannabis is not new in the N.W.T. Legalized cannabis, though, is a controlled substance that is currently being distributed through liquor stores, as member pointed out. And federal requirements mean that it will be tracked from the seed to sale manner, and that's got to be considered in our approach. I don't believe that legalization will add to illegal activities. We can use the liquor as a model. Even though liquor sales are legal, there is an illegal market that continues to exist. And I think early indications are with some of the, I can share some numbers from as of noon today, we had 122 registered customers. We've had 37 orders placed, so we've had well over $5,000 worth of product that's been sold already. That's an early indicator, 12-hour indicator that we have put a dent into the illegal market. And it is a controlled substance, so people that buy from a legal vendor will know that they have a federally controlled substance, and they will be, they can have the assurance that it is a safe product. I wish we could eliminate bootlegging completely, not only with cannabis, but with liquor, but unfortunately, realistically, that's always going to exist. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey, oral question, Cassie, member Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the Minister for his reply, and certainly we appreciate getting the early indicators. It's at this point that I would almost feel like I would like to inject a Jeff Spicoli quote, but in fact I don't have one off the top of my head, so I'll leave it at that. Bad joke number 3. However, Mr. Speaker, if I can, now that pot is legal, the government has committed to opening private retailing in 6 months. We are seeing the excitement today in the media as retailers open across the country. Is the government committed to fully supporting retail cannabis as part of the growing and diversifying economy in the Northwest Territories? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, our commitment was to have regulation and processes in place to assess anyone considering opening a cannabis store. We've released our regulations and information guide for anyone that might be considering opening a cannabis store well before the 6 months, and we will work with anyone considering opening a cannabis store. Opening a store within the retail framework has been released. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you.
Massey, oral question, Cassie, member Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you to the Minister for his reply, and that leads me to my next question, and that is the government currently accepting and processing applications so retailers can be ready next April when the 6 months is up, or is April when we'll start processing applications? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey, Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we've not been contacted by any potential retailers at this point. Should interested parties come forward, we will assess those as described in the information guide that was released. So we would work with those that are considering becoming a vendor because we have released the guide. So the answer, I guess, is yes, we would look at starting to process applications. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, non-directed member Yellowknife North.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the Minister for informing us of that. And we can now look forward to the applications rolling in, hopefully. Rolling in. Yeah. Bad joke number 4. Okay, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the government's retail cannabis framework document lays out a pretty detailed guide for retailers, and I want to commend the government for their effort on putting that together. What steps is the department taking to prepare for its own inspection and enforcement when it comes to the role of when private retailing is permitted? How is the government preparing to, as it relates to inspection and enforcement? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, that was almost number 5 there. The agreement that a vendor enters within the agreement that a vendor enters into within the N.W.T. Liquor and Cannabis Commission online requirements and inspection activities. So they would enter into agreement. They would allow for the inspections and the online guide outlines the requirements that would be needed. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, carrying the member Hay River North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This cannabis issue is multifaceted, so I have some questions for the Minister of Justice. He's not going to get off the hook today. There's been a lot of talk of the roadside testing for cannabis, for impaired driving. So I'd like an update from the Minister. I believe the N.W.T. has procured these roadside drug testing kits. Have they been distributed across the territory, and are they available to all officers? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I know that a roadside drug screening device was approved at the end of August, but I'm not certain whether it has actually been deployed across the Northwest Territories as of yet. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Nakita member Hay River North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Hopefully the Minister can provide that information sooner than later. This has been discussed in this House before. Officers are being trained to use the equipment, as well as, I believe, to detect impairment without the equipment. I know there was a training program that officers were going through, and they had a timeline. How many officers in the territory have been trained to date in cannabis impairment testing? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There are different types of programs that are taking place. There is the standardized field sobriety testing and the drug recognition expert training. I can advise that 31 police officers are trained in the SFST, and 4 members have been trained in the DRE. Thank you.
Oral question, Tada member Hay River North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I figured it would have been more than 4 members by now, but I know that there's a lot of challenges facing the RCMP in the territory, and you can't just send them all out for training. So hopefully we can get an updated timeline from the Minister about when all that training will be completed. One concern that we saw in the media was that these roadside testing kits might fail in cold weather. And so I want to know from the Minister, what has the department put in place to monitor the occurrence of false positives so we're not wrongly charging our residents? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Justice.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I understand that there has been some concerns about the reliability of these tests in cold weather. I am assured that the tests are quite reliable, and if they aren't, doubtless they will be tested in the courts. Thank you.
Merci. Oral question, Nundere member Hay River North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So I just want some clarification on that last answer. The Minister is aware there's been concern about the reliability, but he's not concerned about the reliability, and so there's nothing in place to test the reliability. Is that correct? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yes, I do understand that there are concerns about the reliability of the results of the tests. However, if there are concerns about the reliability, I'm sure that Defence Counsel will attempt to make applications in court so that the reliability of those tests can be reviewed. I do understand, however, that the machines are quite reliable and have been tested in various locations and climates in Canada. Thank you.
Merci. Oral questions. The member Kamlik.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, a number of constituents have approached me with concerns around international travel now that cannabis is legalized, particularly into the United States. I'm wondering if the Premier, in his role as Minister of Executive and Indigenous Affairs, which includes intergovernmental relations, if he's had any conversations with the federal government as to how this is going to work. Thank you.
Merci. The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I haven't had any specific conversations about international travel, but I do know that international borders are a federal responsibility and that the legalization of cannabis in Canada did not change Canada's border rules. Taking cannabis or any product containing cannabis across Canada's international borders is illegal and can result in serious criminal penalties both at home and abroad. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, member Kamlik.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Earlier today, the Minister of Border Security and Organized Crime Reduction at the federal level gave a press conference and said that Canadians should be vigilant, but otherwise should have no issues crossing the border. That's relatively new information, and I don't think it's well understood at this point. Can the Premier reach out to his federal counterparts and get more information on the subject and clarify it so Northern residents know it's safe to travel, where they can travel, and what they're allowed to do? Thank you.
The Honourable Premier.
Certainly, Mr. Speaker, but we do know that it's illegal to travel with marijuana if you're going abroad, and I believe the issue with the United States was that if you worked in a facility involving marijuana and you went to the United States, it would be illegal. They later clarified that as long as you were going on a holiday, it would be okay, but I guess so it's important for us to get more clarification from the United States rather than just getting it through the TV or through the media. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question. Member Kamlik.
I'm glad the Premier shares my interest in this matter and agrees it's important. So when he does get this information from the United States or through the federal government, will he bring that report back to the House or at least make it available on a government website or through some sort of public statement? Can he commit to that? Thank you.
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I can commit to that, but in the meantime, Northwest Territories residents traveling abroad should consult with the Government of Canada's website around cannabis and international travel. Most countries, including the United States, have a zero-tolerance policy with respect to illegal drugs, including possession and use. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, the member Nanakput.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it's been 2 weeks since MTS cancelled the barge delivery to Paulatuck in the two communities outside the territory, and no tenders have been awarded yet, Mr. Speaker, which is increasing the cost of living for constituents in my region. Mr. Speaker, I have follow-up questions for the Minister of Infrastructure on the MTS operations for the upcoming airlift to Paulatuck and Ulukhtuk, which do not include the gasoline delivery to Sax Harbour. Mr. Speaker, the Minister noted that he would not consider Tuck as a port for the North, given its ideal position as traffic increases in Northwest Passage. Mr. Speaker, my first question to the Minister is the cost of the airlift has to come from somewhere, given there may be as many as 100 or more flights worth millions of dollars. Mr. Speaker, my question is, will this additional cost fall on taxpayers in Northwest Territories? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First of all, I want to update the House a little bit from what I know what's going on today. The tenders have been awarded, and I believe the first flight is going into Paulituck probably today hauling fuel. So that process is underway. As far as Sax Harbor, the member also asked me a question. He emailed me asking me about Sax Harbor for fuel. I've looked into that matter, and Sax Harbor has significant gasoline in our community, so that isn't an issue. As far as where are we going to recover the cost of funding this operation, the fuel is going to come out of the POL revolving account, and for the transportation of commodity and goods going into the community is going to come out of the MTS revolving fund. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Oral question. The Kidada Council member in N.W.T.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the response, and it's good to see. I looked on the website this morning. There were no tenders awarded, and hopefully that process can start soon. Mr. Speaker, the minister stated that this error for not delivering fuel was due to ice. However, will the minister commit to ensure that petroleum products are inspected and meet the requirements before allowing any MTS barges, allowing onto any MTS barges, so that this doesn't happen again, or commit to other shipping methods? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Minister of Infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The fuel situation that arises in part of the delay, and tomorrow when I do, I'm doing a minister statement on the whole issue around this marine MTS and the supply and stuff, and we'll be updating the House there. And I'm actually going to reach out to committee and ask them if they want a briefing on this whole issue. But the fuel that caused some of the delays this year was not even fuel for us. It was for a customer. It was shipped to Hay River via the railroad, and it did not meet spec when it reached there. And then we're not talking like 5-10 gallons of fuel here. We're talking hundreds of millions of liters. And that caused a significant delay. And that is something that is part of the proponents' problem. It wasn't even our fuel. It wasn't for our communities. It was a customer's problem. But we will work closely with the oil company. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Oral question. Tadade Council member in N.W.T.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's good to have good answers, and I believe that the minister is doing his work for that. Mr. Speaker, however, MTS is a carrier of products, whether they're petroleum products or dry goods, around the territory, and I see this as a logistical issue. Mr. Speaker, I think what we really need to do, or the department needs to do, is pinpoint where this error started and work from there. And Mr. Speaker, my question to the minister is, will the minister be accountable for this, or will he ensure that the people that did not do their due diligence at their work are accountable for this, and that we ensure that errors like this do not happen again, as shipping is a small window of opportunity in the territory? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First of all, I answered the question last week, and where the members ended it saying that was an error, and I said this isn't an error. This is a combination of a whole bunch of factors. When I do my minister's statement tomorrow, we will clearly lay it out. There's certainly lessons learned from this thing. I'm not saying that the department is not going to learn something from this. Of course we're going to learn something from this. I think with the announcement that we just did in Hay River around the double hull barges is going to help alleviate some of the situation. I've referred last week, maybe we do have to change our scheduling. But that's something we've got to look at. We're going to have to work closely with all our partners, with the communities, with Canadian Coast Guard, and maybe we do look at something in Tuck. But at this point right now, to clearly blame some individual or some people within my department that this was an error on our part is clearly not true. This was a combination of a number of things, and that's why I've offered committee a briefing to go through this all, and so everyone can know clearly where we stand and what the situation was. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question. Nundere Council member in N.W.T.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the response. Mr. Speaker, it sounds like somebody was asleep at the wheel somewhere along the way. In this case, it's the wheelhouse in this era for MTS, for them to wake up into freezing ice and not be able to move anywhere. Mr. Speaker, I appreciate the work that the minister is doing, and I appreciate his work all around. However, somebody needs to be accountable somewhere, and we cannot deflect this any further. Mr. Speaker, my question to the minister is, will this airlift affect the future rates to be paid by MTS customers? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Minister of Infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. No, this airlift will not affect future rates. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Excuse me. Oral question, the member Mackenzie Delta.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I have a few questions for the Minister responsible for MACA. Follow up to my member statement. Although MACA didn't play a lead role in creating our cannabis legislation, the department's role in working with communities is going to be critical if we want the N.W.T to respond successfully to legislation. I'd like to ask the Minister, what is the department doing to support community governments as they navigate this changing legal landscape? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Municipal Community Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we're part of the Interdepartmental Committee overseeing the implementation of cannabis legislation here in the Northwest Territories. One thing that we are doing, though, is looking at having a conference and bringing in people from each of the communities to attend the conference and looking at addressing any community governance concerns, hamlets, communities, bands. We'll be looking at striving to support the community governments and their understanding of this legislation or any concerns that they might have. Now we're looking at having this conference sooner than later because legislation just came through. We were looking at having it in November. However, with the tourism and a lot of conferences going on, it was hard to get that conference up and running. So we are looking at January to have that conference. So all hamlets, all community governments can get ready to look at coming in. Some of the things that we're going to be looking at is business licenses, looking at plan review. Fire safety is going to be a big one now that it has become legalized. Community planning, zoning bylaws are some other things that we need to look at. So all of those are going to be encapsulated in that conference that we're going to hold. So appreciate the members' question, and it's something that we are looking at. As I mentioned, we are part of this interdepartmental committee, and we're going to try to address it and make sure that we have a good transparency approach to working with our community governments. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Oral question, Cassie member Mackenzie Delta.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we have some time here as we're not doing the O&M right now, but in my member statement, I talked about the need for more resources for enforcement in our small communities. Can the Minister commit to reviewing the funding his department provides to small communities for enforcement purposes and to increase it where needed to tackle cannabis legislation? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Minister of Municipal Community Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And as this legislation just came through, I know there was concern about funding for all communities across the Northwest Territories. And as the member knows, we just recently did have an election, and we are going to be reaching out to the new mayors, the new councils, new N.W.T, if there's going to be a new N.W.T board, and have these kind of discussions with them. We knew this legislation was going to be coming in. We had discussions and concerns brought up at our last meeting when Cabinet did meet with the N.W.T. We'll continue to work with the local government administration as well, and make sure that as this legislation unfolds, that we will be there to adapt and revise any types of work that we need to. Right now, funding enforcements, we don't know what they're going to be. We are going to have to work with the Department of Justice as well as other departments to make sure that we can adjust to how this legislation proceeds. So it's early days, and we will be working with this interdepartmental committee to make the necessary changes. And like I said, working with our partners, the N.W.T and LGAN. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Cassie member Mackenzie Delta.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, MACA School of Community Government does very important work in our small communities. Can the Minister commit to developing training materials for delivery through the school on cannabis-related municipal planning and enforcement from the community perspective? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Municipal Community Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And yes, that's a very good idea. With my other hats, Housing Corporation, we are looking at developing some signage and communication to get out to all our public housing units. I know the Department of Health and Social Services is working on some really good education and awareness information. So we will work with our committee to see what we can develop. And we do have some really good training opportunities where we can go online and do some kind of like e-learning workshops with our regional centers. So that is a very interesting concept, and we'll make sure that our interdepartmental committee takes that into consideration when we're getting this information out to our regions and out to the communities. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral questions. Canada, the member, Yellowknife Centre.
Mr. Speaker, my questions are for the Minister of Education, Culture and Employment. Excuse me, last week she put out a news release that said that education leaders were interested in talking about cannabis when she met with them, and that ECE had compiled information for students, teachers and parents, so they are fully aware of the regulations surrounding this matter. My first question is, does the information only deal with regulations, or does it deal with health effects as well? Thank you.
Minister of Education, Culture and Employment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So the information does deal with health effects as well, especially geared towards the student population. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Cassie, member, Yellowknife Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for that response to the Minister. The Minister also said that the information would be circulated well in advance of the October 17th legalization date. Can she please confirm that that was the case? Thank you.
Minister of Education, Culture and Employment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yes, we've given all the information to the district authorities, and then they are in the, I'm assuming they've done it at the beginning of September, or at least in October, they're getting that out to all of the principals within all of the schools. So by now, all schools should have the information available. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Cassie, member, Yellowknife Centre.
Mr. Speaker, at the level of parents, what information can they expect to find in the future on the ECE website about cannabis education in the school? I note that there doesn't seem to be anything there at this point. Thank you.
Minister of Education, Culture and Employment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So we're trying to do as much as we can. We are working with Health and Social Services. There was a brochure sent out to every resident in the Northwest Territories, I believe, with information on it. We've done quite a few things. On October 3rd, we had a Facebook Live on our ECE website that was talking with Dr. Matthew Hill on the effects of marijuana. Again, we used her on October 4th at NAC, Northern Arts and Cultural Center. She was in person. There was an online webinar for especially geared towards grades 7 and 12 to 12. October 9th, we did an online webinar in French. October 10th, we did more presentations provided to all the principals, etc. So, but I do take the members' note, and if we don't have enough information, I will review that, and we need to bump it up. If we don't have enough on there, then we need to make sure it's accessible. So thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you for bringing it forward.
Oral question, Cassie, member, Yellowknife Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Minister for her responsiveness. My final question is, if parents have questions about the cannabis information or about cannabis as it relates to students and their children, is there a number they can call or an email address they can use to ask those questions, whether of this minister or any other minister? Thank you. That's a good idea.
Minister of Education, Culture and Employment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So parents, of course, like I say, we're trying to keep them as informed as possible. We recognize there's a lot of fear out there, and there should be a lot of fear out there. So they can contact their principals at any time for any instance, but we also have it on the Executive and Indigenous Affairs website. I'm going to try to read this off. So it's https://www.eia.gov.nt.ca/en/cannabis, and on that site you can get information, common questions, contact forms for specific questions. So again, we're trying to keep the parents as informed as possible. We're giving literature for students, for teachers, for parents, and we will monitor it as needs come forward. If we find out we need more, we will try to do our best to accommodate that need. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral questions. Member Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. My questions are for the Minister of Lands and have nothing to do with cannabis. I visited the old Esso tank farm adjacent to the Con mine here in Yellowknife recently and found the site in a bad state. I even sent the Minister some rather nasty photos. Although the tanks are finally gone, some of the fencing is about to fall down and the old mine tailings remain uncovered. Can the Minister tell us who's responsible for fixing the fence that is beginning to fall over at this site? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Lands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The parcel of land that's known as the Esso tank farm is titled to, in fee simple, by Imperial Oil. So the condition of the site is the responsibility of Imperial Oil, including when they choose to remediate the site. The fencing also, as I understand it, belongs to Esso. Thank you.
Merci. Oral question, Member Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I'd like to thank the Minister for that. This is not the first time I've raised the issue in the House. So can the Minister commit to picking up the phone and calling Imperial Oil about fixing the site out there? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Lands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I don't think I'm going to be phoning Imperial Oil, but I do understand that the Department of Environment and Natural Resources has been communicating with Imperial Oil about the property during the demolition phase. So there has been contact between Imperial Oil and the N.W.T. Thank you.
Merci. Oral question, Member Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I thank the Minister for that. I know he's a bit facetious, but the fence is about to fall over and we don't want people getting in there and running around. When I was out at the site, there was also all-terrain vehicle tracks outside of the fence on bare mine tailings. It's not clear whether this is part of the road right-of-way or what. Can the Minister tell us who is responsible for the remediation of the areas outside of the fence next to the road itself, as this material is being spread all over the place? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Lands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I understand that the roadway itself is on N.W.T. land, but the city maintains the road. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Member Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Well, I appreciate the response from the Minister, since this is N.W.T. land, which is right next to the roadway itself. What are we doing then to deal with the tailings that are there? Because there are all-terrain vehicle tracks, stuff's being spread out. It's our responsibility. What is the Minister doing about it? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Lands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yes, as I mentioned, the property is apparently, or the roadway is apparently owned by the N.W.T. I perhaps can get back to the member opposite after I've spoken with ENR also about this, as well as my own department. I think a more detailed response would be necessary. Thank you.
Merci. Oral questions. Member for Cam Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to ask the Minister of Finance about the regulations for private sales that he's brought forward. I've taken a look at them, and the concerns I've heard from other people who are interested in a business: you need to sign a lease, you need to have a development permit, you need to have an extensive criminal background check, and this is all before you start the application process. These seem to be incredibly onerous and incredibly hard to get retail businesses off the ground. Can the minister, does the minister truly believe that this meets the goals of the Standing Committee's recommendations that privatization be an element of our cannabis regime? Thank you.
Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we want to be sure that we have those that are seriously interested in fully qualified candidates to be vendors of cannabis. So I believe it's a fair deal. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Member Kamlik.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And quoting from the first part of the vendor designation section of the regulations, the minister needs to be satisfied that the operation of a cannabis store by the person would be economically viable. So the minister is going to determine the market conditions before the market is allowed to determine those conditions. I don't know of any other business that's run this way or permitted this way. Can the minister clarify what these regulations mean by economic viability of a potential applicant? Thank you.
Minister of Finance.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, much like with any business venture, the vendors would come forward with a business plan, and they would see that whether there's a market for the product or not. I think through the early work that we're doing using the liquor store model, I think it would be a good determination of what type of market is out there. One thing we don't want to see happen is those getting into the business thinking that is a cash cow, when a lot of us know that it may not be. So we just want to make sure that they know what they're getting to and that it's a viable operation for them. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Oral question, Member Kamlik.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, earlier the minister commented that the Liquor Commission has made $5,000 in the first hour of sales. It seems like a very viable operation. So again, why is the minister putting a criteria on that he needs to be the one to determine if a business is going to be successful before that business is allowed to exist? Thank you.
Minister of Finance.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, yeah, the member is correct. I did say that there was a good uptake at the beginning, and it made over $5,000 already, but that's now like 14 hours into the legalization of cannabis. Maybe once the excitement wears off, the novelty wears off, or it's not the flavor of the day, then there might be some changes and it might get back to business as usual. The minister doesn't make the final determination. I'm not going to sit there and decide whether this business is viable. I would rely on the recommendations of those that would provide some technical and financial advice. So I don't make the ultimate decision as to whether this business is going to go or not. I would listen to recommendations like most good leaders do. I would listen to recommendations, make a decision, an informed decision based on that. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Oral question, Member Kamlik.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm certainly not questioning the minister's judgment or the advice he receives from the quality staff and the public service. My question is, why are the regulations worded in a way that is putting, I mean, the minister's telling us now, Mr. Speaker, that he's not sure if this business is going to continue to boom or if it's going to go down. It doesn't sound like the minister is aware of the economic viability of cannabis in the Northwest Territories. So how are business owners or entrepreneurs who look at these regulations given comfort that the minister is not going to say no because he's worried about them failing? Let the market decide. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and that's exactly what we're trying to do. Thank you.
Oral question, Sadzilahonwu. Written questions. Written questions. Returns to written questions. Returns to written questions. Replies to Commissioner's opening address. Replies to Commissioner's opening address. Petitions. Petitions, reports of standing special committee. Reports of standing special committee, reports on committee on the review of bills. Reports on committee on review of bills. Tabling of documents. Tabling of documents. Notices of motion. Notices of motion. Notices of motion for first reading bills. Notices of motion for first reading bills. Motions. Motions. First reading bills. First reading bills. Second reading bills. Second reading bills. Consideration committee of the whole bills and other matters. Bill 7. Minister Statement 19-18.3. Table document 215-18.3 with member for Hay River North in the chair.
I call Committee of the Whole to order. What is the wish of committee? Mr. Testart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that the chair rise and report progress. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Testart. There's a motion to report progress. The motion is in order and non-debatable. All those in favor? All those opposed? Motion is carried. I will rise and report progress. Thank you, committee.
May I have the report, member Hay River North?
Mr. Speaker, your committee has been considering Bill 7, Chartered Professional Accountants Act, Minister Statement 19-18(3, Aurora College Foundational Review Process, tabled to document 215-18(3, Capital Estimates 2019-2020. I would like to report progress, and Mr. Speaker, I move that the report of the Committee of the Whole be concurred with.
Do I have a seconder? Member for South 2. Motion's in order. All those in favor? All those opposed? Motion carried. Must see. Third reading of bills. Third reading of bills. Mr. Clerk, orders of the day.
Orders of the day for Thursday, October 18th, 2018, 1:30 p.m. Prayers, minister statements, member statements, return to oral questions, recognition of visitors in the gallery, acknowledgments, oral questions, return to written questions, replies to the Commissioner's opening address, petitions, reports of standing and special committees, reports of committees on the review of bills, tabling of documents, notices of motion for the first reading of bill, motions, motion 21-18(3, first reading of bills, second reading of bills, consideration in Committee of the Whole of bills and other matters, Bill 7, Bill 8, Minister Statement 19-18(3, Table Document 215-18(3, Report of Committee of the Whole, third reading of bills, orders of the day.
Mr. Clerk, this House stands adjourned until Thursday, October 18, 2018 at 1:30 p.m.